Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, we're lucky to have another presenter in our Teacher Leader webinar series going on this year. I'm happy to introduce Derek Carroll from Falmouth Middle School. Derek is a former participant in my Teacher Leader cohort program. He is here today to talk about making the case for current events and how he embeds that in his classroom in terms of making not only what's going on in the news, but making connections that are relevant for the students. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Derek.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Case for Current Events. As Joe said, I am Derek Carroll, and I teach 7th grade social studies at Falmouth Middle School. This is my 10th year in the classroom, and I've had an up and down, varied history with current events. If I think about the way that I'm doing current events now versus the way that I was doing current events when I first started teaching, I really feel like I owe my first couple of years students an absolute apology. However, the good news is my methodology has changed quite a bit. And where I used to dread doing current events with students, it's now something that I look forward to, and it's something that I feel elevates what I'm already doing in the classroom. My hope is that you will kind of leave this webinar this afternoon feeling equally excited about current events, and I hope to leave you with just some things to think about to make current events work best for you. So without further ado, what's going on in the news right now? When I first started putting together this webinar, I was thinking more from the angle of, using current events to better elevate what you're doing in your classroom. And then the news of January started rolling in with riots at the US Capitol, the House voting on a second impeachment, the Biden inauguration, COVID vaccine information coming in, information about new strains of COVID, the Senate set to try a second impeachment. And that's just what's been going on for this month. And it began to kind of sit with me that maybe instead of looking at current events from a perspective of, how they can elevate what you're already teaching, and that's still part of this webinar, have no fear, but maybe there's another case to be made for current events as well. We look at a lot of these events in the news, and these are things that our students are hearing when they're outside the walls of our classrooms. These are things that students are hearing their parents talking about. They are things that they're seeing on social media and on television. And it strikes me that in some cases, our students may not necessarily have the tools that they need to really make sense of everything that they see and everything that's going on. So when we start to make the case for current events, we really want to take a look at current events as a form of information literacy. We do a really good job teaching students how to be literate in ELA, teaching them how to be literate in math. And when it comes to information literacy in social studies, I think sometimes we gloss over it and we lose sight. I'd like to think it's because it's something that as social studies educators or as educators in general, it's something that comes very easy and we don't realize that there are steps that we're going through when we interact with an informational source. But we can use current events to really help students build their own informational literacy. And this is one of the ways that I typically use current events in my classroom. I also started to think that, we can teach news as a genre. There are things that we do when we interact with a news source that are very unique to that particular genre. And I'll get into that a little bit more later on in this webinar. And we can help students identify and understand the sources that they're using or that they're coming across. To do this, we should explain to them that, a news source, a trustworthy, reliable news source has certain standards that it needs to live up to for publication. And this is different than maybe just pulling news off from social media or seeing what is trending on Twitter. And while there is certainly a place for that, and I myself use Twitter quite often, helping students navigate and differentiate the different types of sources that they're using, what the pros are, what the cons are. We can use current events in our classroom to help this out. And then I really like us to start thinking about how we engage with the news. What steps do we go through when we see a headline or read a news article? I myself was reading an article the other day that had a very, very attention grabbing, clickbaity, if you will, headline. And I clicked on that article. And as I began to read through it, um, the information that was presented was not necessarily in keeping with the headline of that article. And that happens from time to time. And knowing that when I personally engage with the news, I go beyond just reading the headline and actually getting into and reading the article, that's an important thing to teach students to do as well. And it's an important skill to make sure that students have, is that you need to dig deeper than just the headline. And sometimes you need to dig deeper than the first couple of paragraphs of that article. And this is all part of something that we can do to really teach students how to interact with current events, uh, but also, teaching them to use them in a way to gather information. And then lastly, kind of as we think about using current events in the classroom, I kind of want to return to this idea of what's our responsibility. Um, Again, we have students that have very different backgrounds. Their families have very different outlooks on life in a number of areas. And in some cases, there's not a guarantee that they're spending a lot of time talking about news. I myself come from a family where even to this day, my parents, my grandparents, very much wear the fact that they don't engage with news sources as sort of a badge of honor. And for students that aren't getting someone else in their life showing them how to navigate these sources, I think our responsibility is to help them understand how to navigate the sources and to be able to be informed. So that's sort of the things that I think about when I think about, making a case for current events. Moving forward, like, how do we use these in the classroom though? I'd like you to take a little bit of time to consider what you're already teaching in the classroom. The units that I go through in a year, I start my year off teaching geography. And then my second term is focused on doing an inquiry approach to the medieval world. And then my final term of the year is kind of doing a more hands-on medieval experiential unit. And I find ways to insert current events into each of those sections of my classroom, not as a separate entity or a separate assignment, but they are things that I do as part of my learning goals already. And in that way, I begin to think about how current events can elevate that. So as I was doing my unit on geography this year, and as we've been working in a hybrid model, as I've been having kids on some of their days at home, I really wanted them kind of crawling through news sources. I'll talk about sources that I use towards the end of this webinar. But I wanted them to select an article that was interesting to them. And then I wanted them to take the step of explaining to me how it connected to some of the concepts that we were already doing. In part, this is to cultivate student engagement. I want them to have an interest in what's going on in the current events that they are working with. I want them to choose articles that appeal to them, and really the type of article that they choose, at least in the beginning, uh, is not as important to me as the fact that they are choosing one that speaks to them. Uh, what ends up happening here is there will be some students that pick up on articles that focus on environmental issues across the globe. Other students will pick articles that focus more on political issues or ideas of equity. And then occasionally, you'll have students that are really, really interested in the, the interest article or the interest piece. This year, it was specifically a dog in California that had been elected as governor. And I let them choose these articles, and I want them to just read about something that they are engaged with. Now, granted, I'm working with seventh grade students. You might have different expectations for your own students. But at my level, I want to make sure that we start out our work with current events in the beginning of the year in a way that is exciting and engaging, and in a way that they can look forward to it as part of their week or part of the lesson that is coming up. Um, Typically, what I would have students do is once they've chosen their article, they would explain to me how it connects to the concepts that we've been talking about. In my geography unit, they had to choose one of the 5 themes of geography that they had discussed or that we had discussed together, and explain to me where that fits into the article that they read. Uh, some of them certainly had an easier time than others based on the articles that they picked, but almost universally, if a student picked an article that they were really interested the first time and read it and couldn't make the connection, they picked another one where they could. And in that case, they're engaging with 2 different news articles during the same day. And that's great. They had the one where they were excited to read it, and then they kind of worked on the terms that I needed them to work for a little bit. And I also always make sure that I set aside time to have discussions around current events issues. When working with the articles of student interest, we sat down and we had a discussion about all of the articles that students chose for that day. And we jumped again from talking about, wildfires in California, um, to having a conversation about a dog that was mayor of a town. And in that conversation, we actually got to have a side conversation about why it's important to have news that is also lighthearted and are things to focus on, that maybe it's not always grim and not always bad news. The news can also be something that has a little bit of levity to it. Uh, but as I'm thinking about how to use current events in the classroom, I'm always going to be thinking about the learning goals that I've put together previously. I want to make sure the current event is something that is connected to what I'm already doing. It's something that I use as a tool uh, rather than an extra step in the week or an extra thing for students to do. I think about how I used current events, as I said earlier, when I first started teaching, and I feel like I went about this the wrong way. They were very much a separate part of my week. They were a separate thing that we did, and they had absolutely no connection to what we were doing. Uh, and I noticed in like contrasting those 2 approaches, students are far more excited about current events when it doesn't seem like it's another task to check off the to-do list, but more a tool that they're using to learn about and engage with the content that we're already talking about. So while that's the goal, is to really work it into what we're already doing, we also need to think about, what are some of the things that we do when we interact with the news, because we want to be teaching student literacy alongside this. So I would certainly encourage you to kind of maybe take some time to jot down answers to these questions as you think of them. Maybe kind of discuss it in the chat with one another would be a good idea as well. I want to slide ahead, excuse me. I tried to read the chat and I stopped screen sharing. Can everyone still see my screen?
Your screen is not up, Derek.
Okay, thank you.
There is one question in the chat. So it can be a question for later, but maybe you want to address it as you're bringing your screen back up. It says, what about self-interest and self-selection for the current events for students?
Okay.
So you can put that in your pocket right now if you'd like to.
Yeah, I will certainly put that in my pocket, and here we go. This should be, there we go. Yeah, I'll take some time for self-interest and self-selection. What I do is I use Newsela a lot in my classroom. And that's the go-to place that my students know to start looking for current events. The reason why I use Newsela personally is I like a lot of the features that allows students to kind of choose a Lexile level that works for them. I think they have a nice variety of articles as well. And it's a source that I want students to get used to because I use it for other things later on as well. I like to kind of collect text sets, and you can assign articles through Newsela. It is a paid resource and my district pays for it. And there are certainly other things out there as well that will be useful. And there's a section towards the end of the webinar where we talk a little, or I talk a little bit about choosing a source that works for you and for your students. For right now, just some personal reflection. Where do you typically get your news? Because I know personally, when I'm scrolling for news, I'm not using Newsela at home. That is something that I use specifically with students. And I will admit that one of the sources, as I kind of hinted at earlier, that I typically kind of scroll news is on Twitter. And there are certainly pros and cons. What are the pros of that particular source? I have a lot of access to a lot of news sources, some far more reliable than others. But I'm able to see things that are happening fairly instantly. The cons, there's a lot of misinformation to sift through. There are a number of steps that I take prior to determining if a source is reliable, and students don't necessarily have all of those skills yet. So would I recommend Twitter as a source of news to students? No, because there's a lot of informational literacy that I would like to see them do and learn in a safer space first. One where there's less opportunity for kind of being led astray, things that are a little bit more reliable. I talk a lot about kind of looking for the Associated Press credit when working with news articles and what that means, and kind of looking at the longevity of some of these news institutions. When it comes to determining sources for current events, I would very, very, very strongly recommend that you curate your sources carefully. We are living in an age where misinformation can be incredibly well disguised as legitimate sources. And I really want to take time with a source for current events before I send students there. Um, I tend to look for things and just being aware of the subtext of an article. I was in the process of putting together some sources to give to you today, and actually decided not to because of a lot of the sources that I came across outside of the ones that I typically use, where there was some very cleverly hidden subtext, making some pretty significant judgments on things uh, that at first glance was difficult to catch. So part of this is when you are giving students a source for current events that you want them to kind of sandbox in, making sure it's a place that you've explored for a bit. Again, I personally use Newsela. I think it's what works for myself. It's what works for my students. Occasionally, I'll bring in, if I'm choosing an article, bring in some articles from the outside with the goal of really showing to students when I read an article, these are the things that I go through. So I'm going to check to see if the source is reputable. I'm going to get some background information on the source, some background information on the author if I can find it. And then I'm going to read through the article and I'm going to think, what's the opinion of the author of this article? Can I figure that out, whether it leans one way or the next? And I'm going to model this to my students because ultimately I want that to be a skill that they're able to do on their own as well. I'm going to take a look because I see a lot of things popping up in the chat. Before moving on to the next slide. Looks like a lot of people are saying that their science department does a nice job of integrating current events based on a subject. That's awesome to see. I see some of you sharing some sources with one another. That's excellent. Thank you. Sponsored content, absolutely. I am really excited to see such an active chat. This is great. The other thing that I want to take some time to talk about is current events discussions. Every once in a while, having a discussion about current events is really, really important. It's can be used in a number of ways. Again, talking about the geography unit that I do, we do current events discussions where students kind of take that next step of explaining the article that they chose, but also talking to their classmates and their peers about, how it connects to the concepts that we've learned. Those are some of the first current events discussions that we have. And I use those to create a collaborative set of discussion norms. As we sit down and have that first discussion, we kind of talk with one another about what we need to feel safe in a discussion. I let students really begin to put that list together. And then I have a certain set of non-negotiables that if they don't come up, I will contribute those as well. However, in almost all cases, students get there far before I do. And then I let everyone know that we're all responsible for making sure that we follow those discussion norms. We are collectively responsible for enforcing those as we have our discussions. And this is all to create a culture of respect and safety. As we get to some more difficult topics that we might talk about, if they come up in current events, that's where I really start to anticipate where student comfort level is going to be. And I tend to save these conversations for later in the year for when I really get to know students. It's always a policy in my classroom that if a student needs to just take a break from a conversation for whatever reason, they are more than welcome to do that. They are more than welcome to head down the hallway, grab a drink of water, and take some time to get away from a conversation that maybe they weren't comfortable with. Um, but then I also want to assess my own comfort level as well. Uh, Prior to working where I am now, I spent 9 years working in another part of the state. And the two districts that I've worked in are very, very different in the terms of the community around them. Both are fabulous communities and wonderful places to work. Uh, but having and understanding kind of the pulse of a community and knowing my comfort level uh, with having conversations in each community is important. Students are really, really good at picking up on whether or not their teachers are uncomfortable, and oftentimes will take cues from us. So before going into a conversation, I always take a moment to just kind of reassure myself that the conversation's going to go fine. They typically go fine. And they can be really, really great learning experiences. And just kind of taking that moment to assess your comfort level with a topic and just reassure yourself that it is going to go well, and that as long as the discussion norms that have been established are followed and everyone kind of contributes to that culture of respect and safety, it's going to be a good conversation. Students are going to learn from one another. And in all honesty, we're going to learn from them as well. Um, Again, finding space for current events can certainly be difficult, especially for those of us that maybe uh, teach history that might be kind of set far back. I would still encourage you to do your best to work it in. As I said, the other two units of my year are medieval focused. And I still use current events for those as well. Uh, in some cases, it's a matter of finding articles that have sort of a history focus on them that have already been housed in Newsela. That's where I'm going to start putting together and creating text sets. Although I'll also encourage students to think about some of the big picture concepts that we've covered in our unit. For example, kind of covering medieval history and talking about feudalism and social systems, having them take a look at some current events and seeing if they can draw parallels between social systems is a great way to just reinforce those concepts and kind of get students to think about, you know, sure, things have certainly changed. However, these are still themes running through the news that we see. Uh, Currently in my classroom, I have students working on an inquiry project, and one of the sources that I require for that is a news article looking at some information, like background information around their inquiry question. Uh, it's a really good way to kind of give students a quick surface level understanding of the topic that they are looking at, and letting them know what other concepts, words, terms, and things that they should do uh, to further their research later on. Um, Part of research, again, if it's not a specific inquiry question that I've had students develop, but if students are doing a research project, incorporating current events into that research as a source really solidifies the idea that news articles are information sources. Um, Again, I talked a lot already about having students choose their article for self-selection and then making connections. Uh, that piece I think is really, really important, again, just to get students excited about what they're reading. Uh, and then, of course, there are the events that we find ourselves talking about because it's really, really necessary to talk about them. These are the, as I saw, kind of termed as the day after conversations the other day. These are really taking some time to just giving students the opportunity to ask questions about the really big and oftentimes confusing things that are going on in the news. Whether that, for me this year, that was earlier in the year, kind of talking about, the election process and how the Electoral College works and looking at election maps. That was a current event that I kind of took and pulled some special time to talk about. More recently, it was having some somber conversations with students about what occurred at the US Capitol on January 6th. Uh, Taking the time and uh, letting students know, like, these are the verified facts that we know so far. These are the news sources that they were pulled from, giving students an opportunity to ask questions. And then also really taking the time to let students know what they might expect to see in the next coming days was a huge part of the conversation that I had with my students. And I'm sure that many of you had with your students as well. Um, I prepared them for the fact that they were going to see a lot in the news about that event and individuals involved with it, and investigations and fallout. I think the best question, or the most middle school question that I was asked, kind of in those conversations, was whether or not the people involved with storming the Capitol on January 6th, whether they were in trouble, which to me just resonated as a very, very seventh grade question, and was a good part of the discussion that we had. So this went a lot faster than I was anticipating, but some final thoughts. We are living in a world where information moves really, really quickly, as does misinformation. So using current events to teach students how to navigate information as it's shared online or wherever they're pulling it from is absolutely vital. It is something that we really need to take the time to do and that we really need to make a focus. And there are certainly ways that we can do it that work with what we're already doing, so it doesn't seem like one more thing that is added to our already incredibly busy schedules, especially this year, incredibly busy schedules. Uh, but they can be a tool in our toolbox. And current events are really important, but they're also really useful. We need to teach the literacy around them. We need to make sure that students can engage and interact with a current event in much the same way they could engage and interact with a short story that they read in ELA or a novel or anything else that they're reading. They can be used to elevate what we already do. Again, working them in where they make sense as an opportunity for students to show that they've internalized a concept that we've taught and that they're able to make connections is a really, really good use of current events that doesn't seem out of place. Um, and integrate the activities. Really take the time to make these current events part of just another tool in our toolbox. You have your standard go-tos when you're teaching material, you have your standard activities. Adding current events to that list is a really good way of just opening up what you have available to you as a teacher, but also a way for students to show you what they know. Make sure to take the time to make space for some of the unplanned discussions that pop up. Personally, I feel it's really, really important to address student questions when they have them. Students have a lot of questions, and whether or not they are related to what I immediately teach, I think it's an important thing to, if you don't know the answer to the question, at least help the student find where they can figure out that answer or how to figure out the answer for themselves. As these questions tend to be about fairly high profile current events, uh, one day out of your school year is, I find, is permissible. It's certainly something that you can make space for. That being said, sometimes it seems like those unplanned discussions occur more frequently and with more ferocity than they have in the past, uh, but still taking the time to just let students say what they're thinking, to ask their questions, to give them an opportunity to have their voices heard. I think it can be really empowering. Making sure that in those unplanned discussions that we're thinking about our students' comfort and safety, but also our own comfort and safety is important. It's good to have empathy and model empathy for students, and then just knowing that students follow our lead. And if there is something that we feel we're really uncomfortable talking about, we're going to unintentionally teach students to be uncomfortable talking about that issue as well. At this point, are there any questions? So do I pair with English teachers or librarians? Yes, I have an amazing librarian that at the start of any research unit or at the start of any year, uh, she does an entire presentation with students focused on fact checking and finding the validity of sources. And she works with students on how to really corroborate what they found using multiple sources, to check for the authority of the person who wrote the article, to look at the currency of the information that they found, and would be absolutely lost without her. Absolutely lost. And the students really like to hear from someone else. Usually it's a few weeks into the school year. So seeing that other adult is certainly something that they look forward to. And she is a huge part of helping students with the research phase of the research projects that we do. Are there any other questions?
Last call, any questions? Yep, Alex, everything will be posted. I forgot to ask you, Derek, ahead of time about your presentation. Are we gonna be, can I get a copy of that to upload?
I will definitely send it to you.
Okay, perfect. Yep, Alec, if you give me, I'll drop the link here really quick. Usually within 24 hours, sometimes the same nights, depending on my schedule, all the videos show up on my professional learning page. Oops, sent that to all panelists. So right now the homepage there is everything that's been offered during the 2020/21 school year. Everything that had been previously offered, it shows up in one of the sub pages. So Derek's presentation and video will show up on that homepage, and then it will also be placed on the teacher leader sub page as well. Last call. Does anybody have any questions for Derek?
Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Derek. It was great to see you again. Thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise.